everybody. It's good to interact with you, though I can't see you. My name is Dr. Nakeiha Primus. I am an associate professor at Millersville University. I will be your facilitator this morning, and hopefully this webinar will provide an opportunity for us to think about and problematize what we think of post-secondary success. When I first was asked to do this webinar, the title was tentatively called PK-12 Success for College. And I thought about that notion of college and how Western and how linear and how very narrow that trajectory is, especially for so many of our students who face all kinds of difficulties or challenges or just have interests that don't align with the college path. And so I reframed the webinar so we can talk about all kinds of post-secondary success and hopefully get to a place where we can prepare our students for a holistic version of what that looks like. I want to talk a little bit about myself, just before we get started, as a way to help you understand who I am and where I'm coming from with this work. Part of the reason I am a professor is because I was a student who really thrived under the tutelage of my teachers. When I first started in school, I was able to move faster because my mom made it a point to teach me how to read before I got to school. Interestingly enough, one of the first interactions I had with a teacher, in terms of if we're thinking about success and how people define it, was someone questioned my mom. She told them that I knew how to read. She told them that I was very familiar with literacy and that I loved books and that I loved going to the library. And the first question someone in the school setting asked her was, how? As if it were not possible for this little brown girl from New York City to know how to read because I was from a single parent home. And that always had an impression upon me as a child. Why was it that I didn't have the opportunity, or people perceived that I couldn't have the opportunity to learn something outside of the confines of a school building? And so fast forward through college and grad school, I became a secondary educator in English. I taught both middle and high school English classes for almost a decade. And then about 7 years ago, I found my way to higher education. And in this space, I have found both a passion and a niche for working with students who often have similar stories as my own, for whom success has been a possibility only in their imagination, and who have confronted many different types of obstacles in order to reach their version of success. And so when and where I enter, this slide that you see in front of you is my homage to Pollock work, which allows me to bring to you myself as my whole self, and also makes me attuned to the intersectionality that is a part of my identity. I am a brown woman. I am a person from a certain socioeconomic status. I am an able-bodied person. And so when we think about these notions of success, I want us to keep who and what we are at the forefront of our minds, because this is the place from which I do all of my work. I always have to reflect on my positionality. I always have to reflect on those privileges that I have that my students may not, because it allows me to hear from them. It allows me to guide them based on their own perceptions of what success looks like, and hopefully facilitate their growth toward that vision. In the chat, if you are able, please let me know when and where you enter. What is your name? What grade level or capacity do you have in the school district? And give us like a brief word or two about why you're here. Though I can't see you, I want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. I want to make sure you feel invested in the process. So go ahead and let me know, when and where do you enter this space? What were your thoughts about success as a pre-K student or a 5th grade student or a high school student? And who or what shaped that vision for you? Go ahead and take a minute to do that. Each of you have had an opportunity to put in the chat where and when you enter, and thank you for doing that. I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your willingness to join in on the conversation. And I want to make sure that when we think about when and where we enter, we are discussing some things about our personal background, our expectations, and how those expectations create norms for us as educators. And when we are in the webinar, I want to make sure that we are cognizant of what we do in our classrooms, in our interactions with students, that will help us answer the question, is what I'm doing, is how I'm presenting this information, is how I'm guiding this conversation, is how I'm interacting with this family, this parent, is how I'm choosing books or content for my students, is it going to enhance or inhibit their opportunities for success once they leave me? Now, we all know that the trajectory between PK through 12 is one that has many stops, many pits, many challenges, many inspiring things that happen along the way. So my goal for us today is not to kind of look at us as a collective of pits and stops, but as a journey that we have a fluid interaction with students at each and every step of the way. So my goals for our webinar today are here. If you had an opportunity to download the webinar workshop worksheet, you can put this in if you'd like, but I want to make sure we're clear about why we're here. Number one, to interrogate notions of post-secondary success and assess our individual roles as PK-12 educators in empowering, dismantling, and/or perpetuating these ideals. Two, to examine and reframe 3 key areas integral to sustaining viability and holistic productivity post-high school. And in this goal, this is part of the reason why the notion of college is just one option. I want to be as inclusive and as varied as possible when we think about our students and how we're preparing them for the future. So that includes vocational education, technical education, maybe even the military or other service opportunities, and college and university enrollment as well. And then finally, goal 3, apply a social justice framework to our personal, professional, and collective spheres of influence in order to exact radical paradigm shifts in the ways we prepare students for college and beyond. If you have any questions or would like to add anything else to these goals, please feel free to put those in the chat. We have our facilitators who will definitely let me know how we can infuse some of those ideas into the webinar. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started. The first activity I have for you, if you have that sheet of paper or the workshop worksheet, is to let us all get on the same terms about what success actually means. When we look at that term, like I might have a different version of success, you might have a different version of success, what it looks like, what it feels like, what are the markers and characteristics of that term. So for you, what top 5 personal or intellectual attributes are necessary for students' consistent success beyond high school, in college, vocational trade, in industry, or etc. You can write those down on the sheet of paper that you have. If you want to put them in the chat, I mean, there's so many of us, but we'll gather them. And I have a pretty good sense of what you might say. So I've kind of assumed a little bit, but if I'm wrong, we can definitely discuss that. So for you, what are the top 5 personal or intellectual attributes necessary for students' consistent success beyond high school? Thank you, Leslie. Confidence. What does that look like? Stick-with-itness, knowing where and how to elicit help, thinking critically, drive, grit, resilience. Yes. Perseverance and determination, problem solving, time management, lots of resilience, especially if we're thinking about the last school year, for example, with COVID and the shift between face-to-face learning and internet learning, for lack of a better term. How have our students been able to navigate these new spaces and become or be or find success? Love of learning, ability to problem solve, grit, stamina, focus, a sense of self, needs, wants, and clarity. Vulnerability, thank you, Matt. That is a very good one. Yes. These are all great things, and continue putting those things into the chat. So then my question to you all is, when do you learn these things? Because no one so far has mentioned like calculus, or how to put a square puzzle piece in the square puzzle frame in pre-K. Like, no one has mentioned those very innate type tasks that we do in school, for example. Like, so when and where do you learn how to be confident, for example, because I'm seeing that emerge several times in the chat. When and where and how do you learn drive, right? And so when we think about the things that students, young people need in college, and I would say beyond, in the workplace, in personal relationships, in life in general, how do we engage in processes and experiences that give us learning experience, that give us those things that we've been talking about? Growth mindset, organization, right? So for me, that's where I come from. When we talk about success, no one has mentioned success looks like, you know, $1 million in a bank account. That might be a version of success. But so far, most of us have discussed things that look more intangible. And so if you're a pre-K educator or a 5th grade teacher in science or a 10th grade math teacher, where are there opportunities for these things, these concepts, these personality traits to emerge, for your students to practice them each and every day? I'll give you some insight about me now that I'm on the other side, at least one portion of the other side, right? The 4 C's, Andrew, right? Critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. I totally agree. As a college professor, particularly invested in students who are first generation, non-traditional students, meaning people like career changers, undergraduate student parents, people who have had to navigate life a little bit differently than others. I have found that in facilitating students' growth, there are a couple things that need to happen. And I'm just gonna go to the next slide. So if I were to guess, right? And based on the chat, I told you my assumptions may be all right, like I got a spidey sense. There are 5 areas, perhaps, maybe 4, that I think in terms of success and what that looks like. And success often refers to our ability to communicate. And when I say communicate, our ability to read, write, and think effectively. So yes, school provides an opportunity for us to learn how to read, learn how to do math, learn how to speak well. But when we think about the norms and expectations that come from what communication looks like, particularly in a post-secondary sense, when, and I'm going to ask this question several times, when and how do we get an opportunity to do these things? And are there particular standards, and that's a familiar term for most of us, around communication? And if so, how do we know them? How do we learn them? Similarly, in terms of community, many of us have said, you know, in the chat, in terms of you need support, you need role models, you need to be able to be accountable to either yourself or someone else, right? So how do we foster a sense of community, because it's so necessary for academic employability success? And then, of course, there's this academic preparedness piece, right? We have things like grit. And this is where I saw that in the chat, persistence and resilience, and the no participation trophy for everybody kind of thing, right? So how do we foster those kinds of things? Because yes, kids need to know math, and kids need to know, you know, geography to a certain extent, and kids need to know the, you know, Pythagorean theorem and how to do the scientific method. But underneath those concepts is the notion that you have familiarity with the process of learning, right? You know how to ask questions. You know where to discover information. You know how to be resourceful. How do we learn these things? Because on the other side of 12th grade, after you've gone from pre-K through the whole gauntlet, those are expectations that are held, not just in college, but in the workplace, in our personal relationships, and elsewhere. And then, of course, there's this notion of self-actualization. So either we're nearing self-actualization or we have an emergent identity that is confident. I saw that very much in the chat a few seconds ago. And I'm going to ask the question again. If these are ideas that we align with notions of success, how and when and where do we learn them? And as educators, are we intentional about that process? And so for me, this webinar, just to kind of go back a bit, that's why we're here, right? I want us to interrogate these notions of post-secondary success, particularly because they are so identity oriented. Things like grit and resilience, things like confidence and critical thinking. So much of how we embody those traits have to do with who we are and how we develop that sense of identity. And for us as educators, yes, we have to have a practical application. So we're going to look at curriculum, we're going to look at discipline and classroom management, and we're going to look at family engagement. But I'm going to spend quite a bit of time looking at these notions of success and the expectations that come from them. Like where do we get this from, right? Because so often we focus on the skills, and not because we may want to, but because our profession dictates that through things like accountability standards and Common Core and that kind of thing. I am positive, especially now during COVID, where online learning has taken place, so many of us are like, oh my goodness, we're not going to get through X, or I can't help this student understand Y. But at the same time, if success is not necessarily built on those things, how are we fostering opportunities in the web space, on Zoom, in Google Classroom, wherever, so that those things we were talking about before are at the forefront of the educative experience of our students? Okay? And so I want to take a minute here. Does anybody have any questions, any thoughts, any particularities that they want to share either with me or with the rest of the group? Yes. Yes, Leslie. Go ahead and type. Yep. My principal ends her morning message with, I love you and I expect excellent. That gives our students a sense of community. It gives our teachers a sense of community. Excellent, that's great. And so from the things that we do, we can create situations where we are leading our student. Yes, Benjamin, go ahead. Type it in the chat because I can't hear you. And our facilitators in the chat will definitely go ahead and address it. All right. No worries, Benjamin. No worries. Let's keep moving. So I have just a little bit. So like, where do these expectations come from? And I want to give us a little bit of sociocultural historiography. It's a good thing that I wrote my presentation out because I can't see my notes. But anyway, we're going to move forward. How do we create situations in our academic lives, in our educator lives, in our professional lives with our students, where these 5 things are, and if there are any others that I missed, please put them in the chat and we'll talk about them, where we can foster those traits for our students continuously. So this is a photo, and I am an education historian by training. I teach a few classes in the foundations of modern American education. And for me, because personal narrative is incredibly, incredibly important, the personal narrative of our country is also incredibly, incredibly important, particularly because as an educator, if I don't understand where certain expectations come from historically and where certain notions of success come from historically, I am not going to be able to interact with my students, with their parents, with their families, with the communities in which they live in an authentic way. That is just my personal philosophy. And so there's a lot going on in this particular cartoon. One of the things that I notice is who is included in the direct instruction. Y'all familiar with that term? The direct instruction going on in this classroom, this mock classroom, right? Who has access to the textbooks? Who has access to the teacher? Even the faces and the dispositions that are given to certain people or certain players, let's call them that, in this picture, indicate a certain level of expectation and stratification in American education. That's a lot of shuns, okay? So just to be clear, and this is one of the things that we have to kind of come to some kind of consensus about, because if we don't, talking about personal narrative and how we infuse grit and resilience and hard work and critical thinking and all that, that is going to be a moot point if we don't acknowledge the fact that public education in America has not ever been inclusive, including in 2021. If we have any indication of that, it is through the whole internet process that many students have faced, right? And so we can just agree that American education has not ever been holistically inclusive. That is a great starting point for understanding why certain things exist and how certain expectations come to pass, right? Things like grit and resilience look very different for different populations of students, right? Confidence looks different. Belonging looks different. Academic preparedness looks different. And so when we're talking about those things and we're hopefully moving our third grader to fourth grade or our seventh grader to eighth grade or giving them access to resources to help develop their identities, we are cognizant of the fact that there may be some historical memory, some generational memory that is there that may be hindering their capacity to obtain or even envision what success looks like. If you're with me, give me an emoji in the chat or a hand clap or a hand raise or something like that. Okay, excellent, excellent, excellent. I can see all of you raising your hands on the screen, so that's pretty amazing. All right, and so we can all acknowledge that we come into this institution, and for the most part, all of us, whether we're female, a person of color, a person who receives special education services, a person who speaks a different language, a person who is different in any way, we can acknowledge that certain expectations we have and certain notions of success come from a very specific tradition. And while we can acknowledge that, we can also have a great starting point for, okay, wait a second. Do I have and do I hold any of those, what we call hegemonic dispositions? And am I unintentionally perpetuating them in how I think about, how I interact with, or how I expect my students to be, to exist in my classroom, on the field of play, whether it's, sport or in the theater, whatever. Am I in it unintentionally creating more of an obstacle? Because I am embedded, and we all are. It doesn't matter what your positionality is. There's something that we all hold on to because that's what school does. It makes us conform to a specific way of being. So if we can start there, that's great. So this historiography that I'm kind of giving you in a nutshell just basically says, number one, public school is inherently demarcated, right? There's a hierarchy. It has always been that way. When we think about Horace Mann and Thomas Jefferson and all the great people who started public education in 1695 or whenever, public education was not for everyone. It was for a specific purpose, and there were people who were left out from the beginning. Number two, that means that marginalization is inherent to the space we find ourselves in as educators. If we can acknowledge that, then we can move forward with a common interest, like, okay, this is what it is, but it doesn't have to be that way. All right. Number 3, social justice, meaning the ability to provide equity and liberatory activity or processes, has always also been a part of public education. Marginalization and social justice exist at the same time. They have to. Because if I'm peeking over the ledge of public education and I say, wait a second, I am not a part of this process. And because I am not a part of this process, I am not at liberty to live a certain way. That's why we had the civil rights movement. That's why, women got access to education. I tell my students all the time, the women's rights movement used the notion that women were the nurturers to actually gain access to education. Like, so the stereotype that only women are good at nurturing children actually opened the door for women to get education. At the same time, it did create some stereotypes that persist today in terms of sciences and math and that kind of thing. We all know this, right? And then finally, our history lets us know that the expectations that we hold about success also influence who we think are who can be educated. And if we stop there, if I put a period there, that gives us a lot of power, because we can reframe that as we move our students from first grade to fifth grade to 10th grade, 10th grade to college or employment or vocational education. Because things like grit look different if you're able to acknowledge the history behind where that comes from. That bootstraps mentality did not apply to everyone at the same time. Y'all with me? Great. Let's move forward. Next activity. Given that, what's in your educator DNA? I have my students do a version of this activity every single semester, because I hear things like students are supposed to, students should, students need to have. And I'm like, where does that come from? Right? And as I said from the beginning, our personal identities and where and when we enter this space has an incredible influence on what we do in those spaces. So what points of historic accessibility, agency, or erasure are embedded within your educator DNA? Right? So if you were to go back a few generations, who had access to traditional schooling? Did everybody in your family? Are you a first generation college student or a vocational student? Did you go to the military? If you go back a few more generations, at what point did your family, however you define family, have access to traditional public education in America, if you were educated in America? Okay, that's a whole nother thing. And then the next question is, how do you carry these pre-existing conditions into your work with students? How might these alter, suspend, or enhance their success? So let's take, for example, the notion of resilience, like one's ability to bounce back from adversity. And resilience looks very different when you've had to fight your way through particular institutions instead of when it has been always offered, right? So are you able to recognize the differences in what resilience looks like in different students? Or does it look like aggressiveness? Or does it look like defiance? Or does it look like irritability or inattention, right? What personalized expectations do you have that you create or that you have created for yourself or for your students that look like norms, right? This is normal. Great. Go ahead and include that in the chat. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Leslie. Thanks, Tom, right? Grit is something we see is like a trendy thing now. Like, you got to have grit. You got to be able to like hold on and persist. But what if you're tired? What if that has been your experience since the beginning? What if things like hope look very different for you, right? What if persistence just means I showed up? How do we navigate that when we're supposed to, or we should, prepare students for something beyond themselves, especially if they can't see it for themselves? Or on the flip side, if they do see it for themselves, but the version of success that they have is built on a privilege that they did not earn. Thank you, Susan. Right. And your experience as a parent, as a sister, as a sibling, as a mother, they all inform. I tell my students all the time, I was an educator before I became a parent, and I think I became a better educator once I had children, because then I realized, oh my God, there's so many things that I am doing to my students that I am not aware of. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Bryn. Okay. So when we think about preparing our students for post-secondary success, this is part of the reason why I think we have to start at the personal space. Because I tell my students all the time, the biggest issue in a classroom, more often than not, and not because we want it to be, but just because of the way class and school and public education is set up, is that the biggest issue is you, the teacher. And if you are not willing to interrogate what you're bringing and what your students are reading or feeding off of, because they do, we all know we've had those days. Oh, this person doesn't like me, or this person feels a particular, they can feel it. And if you are unaware of how your personal dispositions, expectations, tone, all that kind of stuff influences the dynamic in the classroom, how on God's green earth are you going to prepare all of your students for success if what we're saying success looks like is critical thinking, an ability to persevere, an ability to have grit, if that's something we want to align with, okay? How are we doing that? Because it's not even about, I haven't even talked about content yet, right? I haven't talked about how pre-K teachers have to teach students how to go to the bathroom. Or I'm not talking about the AP calculus class where you have to learn how to draw a certain type of graph. Those things will come to. But if you're not cognizant of who you are and the essence you bring into the classroom, how then, one, are you going to become aware and in tune with the same thing in your students, right? Because those expectations are bi-directional. Those notions and norms that we have are bi-directional. And when we say, oh, I'm supposed to be a hard worker, that looks different to, Jamie than it does for me based on my experiences. I'm a Deweyan all the way. So I'm all about, experiential education and how it elevates the energy and essence of a dynamic between teacher and student. Okay. Thank you so much for y'all going into the chat and offering your perspectives. I honor your perspectives. I honor your positionality. And I'm glad that we are able to have this discussion in a way that is fruitful and beneficial to you. So before we go on, go ahead and write that down. What points of historic accessibility, agency, or erasure are embedded within your educator DNA? Is there? Have you interrogated it? And if not, why not? And are you holistic? Because this is not about guilt or shame or putting on this like unfair expectation because you've had accessibility. It was meant to be that way. No, that's okay. But what are you going to do with that perspective that you may have? And does that perspective inhibit your ability to perhaps widen the scope of how you interact with students? Okay. Moving forward. So we're going to delve a little bit deeper. I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure I get to the nitty gritty, what to do, how to do it. How does this show up in our spaces and in our lives? Okay. And this is an old quote, but it's a goodie. The belief that schooling can be defined as the sum of its official course offerings is a naive one. Okay, and it basically summarizes everything that I just said. We have to look at the hidden places. We have to look at the shadows. We have to look at the things that the light is actually on in order to move our students beyond our spaces and into fruitful, holistic, productive lives. And that's why I said college is one avenue for that, but college is also a particular, it has a particular history behind it, right? A middle-class American ideology that for many, many, many students was not accessible. And if not, what other options are there? And do they allow students the same or different or better levels of success? Okay. Y'all with me? Give me a hand clap. Raise your hand. Let me see you're with me and we're moving. Excellent, excellent. And like I said, feel free to use the workshop handout that is available on that QR code. Take your own notes. Feel free to add to it. I will definitely make it available to all who want to use it. All right. So now is my time to provoke you, to give you something to think about. Now, I said at the beginning, one of the goals is to look at 3 specific areas, because we could be here all day talking about all the nuanced ways that notions of success show up in our educator lives and in our interactions with students. So I picked the 3 just for the sake of time, just for the sake of relatability, so that we could all have a discussion about this. A supposition is a thought or a theory. And these are suppositions that I just made up based on my experience, my academic research on narrative and the education history of the United States, and based on what I saw, what you all were interacting with in previous iterations of this professional development series. So in terms of content and curricula, we think of often a course of study or a discipline or a subject area. And if you're in my case, you think about the whole experience, from 8 a.m. when you walk in the door to 3 p.m., everything that happens in that time frame is curricula. That's my perspective. But here's some theories about what we think about curricula and content accessibility and how notions of success show up there. Number 1, there are essential ideas or common knowledges that must be taught for students to find success. Right? And some of you are like, yeah, because when I get observed, they're looking at the Common Core and asking me to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, so how do you feel about that? Supposition 2, delineating learners based on their aptitude makes sense as society makes such categorizations. Right? So if the purpose of education is to prepare students for when they're not in school, post-secondary, we need to do things in school that mimic or mirror what actually happens in society, whether or not they do harm or not. So these are my suppositions that act as provocateurs, right? And so how do these notions of success, and I'll go back a bit, we talked about, communication, community, self-actualization, and academic readiness. And those are the categories that we talked about, because y'all put in the chat things like resilience and critical thinking, right? So if our curricula and our content have these guidelines, let's say, that there are essential ideas and that we must delineate learners based on their aptitude, because this is what we do, right? This is how it works. Then what does that do to how we prepare students for after they leave us? I'll pose that question. Give me your thoughts in the chat. Oh. Excellent. The question. One area where our notions of success occur Yes, I'll share the code in a minute. One way our notions of success show up is in how we do content and how we frame or situate curriculum within our schools and in our districts. Like sometimes it's a sequence of events, sometimes it's a series of things that we must do, sometimes it's a measure of accountability for those of us who worked in the classroom as teachers. My suppositions are to provoke you. Are there essential ideas or common knowledges that students must have in order to find success? Should we delineate learners based on their aptitude because that's what society does? Ah, yes. So it makes sense. Students are still figuring out who they are and what their interests are. Yeah, but we have a job, right? So whether you're the principal or the kindergarten teacher or the 10th grade teacher, the curriculum is the primary, at least that's what we are made to feel, the primary mechanism through which we get knowledge to them, right? But if we're talking about success and what that looks like, if there are certain types of knowledges that never get seen, never are interacted with, what does that do to our students? Ah, Michelle, I thank you for your point. So sometimes they equate as with how life out school may be, but we set them up for this false dichotomy. You're absolutely right. So then what do we do? What do we do? I'm going to pause real quick because some people are asking to see the QR code again. So I'm going to just go back. I'm going to stop the share real quick. Hi. I'm going to stop the share real quick just so you can put your phone up to the computer screen and it will allow you to get to the worksheet. So I'll give you all a second to go ahead and do that. For those of you who need that. In the meantime, I'm going to take a look at the Q&A. Yes, Lisa, I will make sure if you're commenting in the chat that it says panelists and everyone, because if you're just chatting directly to me, everyone won't be able to see that. All right, so I'm going to stop the share there and we're going to jump right back in to this conversation, right? So if our curriculum has these suppositions, these theories about what is important for kids to learn, right? This is where Common Core comes from. This is where standards-based education comes from, which this is the environment in which we are all working in currently. Yes. So how do we get beyond this is my question. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I need to move a little bit faster because you all are great participants, giving me wonderful ideas from which to draw upon. But we got to move. We got to move. We got stuff we need to do. So where does this show up? So remember I told you those 4 or 5 different areas. Content and curricula and these norms that we've guided ourselves into believing show up in a lot of different ways. They show up in early literacy initiatives. So I told you when I entered school, I already knew how to read. I was privileged in that way, but was very unique growing up in New York City. And so when we think about the reading and writing and critical thinking aspects of curriculum and how that looks and our ability to communicate and feel confident in that, are we making spaces for those students for whom that is not their experience? What are we doing to prepare students, either through summer programming or packets or whatever in our community in Cheltenham, specifically for you, to ensure that when students enter, let's say kindergarten, because that's one thing, when they enter kindergarten, that they have basic literacy skills? How is the school district partnering with maybe local pediatricians to make sure that that's a goal, because all kids have to go to the doctor to come to school, right? What are we doing to make sure that those things that we talked about before, that's necessary 15 years from now, 18 years from now, begin to happen at an earlier place, right? Same things with this notion of community. How do we make sure everybody has the same access to information in terms of content and curriculum? So one of my own personal things is I have a 5th grader, and I know that in 3rd grade, the students do like a gifted test, gifted education test. Lots of people don't know this. I also know that my daughter does not do well on such tests, but I know she has a gifted bent to the way she thinks. So instead of just letting them give her this test and failing at this test, I asked them to make sure she has a multiple measures assessment for this gifted program. If I didn't know that, would my child have had access to the content and curricular opportunities that her peers, often whom look very different than she does, in the 3rd grade, and now she's in the 6th grade in the gifted program? How do we make sure that parents and community members know how to navigate these processes that inherently group and differentiate their students from early on? What are we doing, right? Like if I didn't know that I could go to school and request a multiple measure assessment for my daughter, she would have just kept going and kept getting in trouble because she talks all the time, and kept getting in trouble because she asks 1,000 million questions all the time, right? So there's those kinds of things that's happening. And when we think about academic preparedness, I am from New York State, and when I moved to Pennsylvania, I did not understand why kindergarten wasn't full day, because that was my experience. But things like that impact a child's success later on. Now, I'm not saying we need to change policy and talk about taxes and all. I'm just asking questions and presenting information, right? Because when my daughter went to kindergarten, I had to put her in private school in order for it to be full day because I work full time. But what if you don't have that option? And with my younger daughter, now I have time, which is a resource that some people, depending on their socioeconomic status, the way their family is structured, all kinds of variables, they don't have in the same ways. So if you are an educator in your students, and you teach 6th grade, for example, and you require certain things that require time, which is a resource not everybody has in the same way, how might that inhibit, suspend, or enhance what that child is able to do later down the line? Okay, if you're with me, put something in the chat, let me know. We're gonna keep going. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, and then the notion of, how does curriculum and content accessibility influence student self-actualization? And this is a conversation that we've had multiple times. Like who are the protagonists in your curricular choices? Do you use things that your kids bring to you? Do you use real world examples? And this is a touchy thing, because we have all seen the news, and I'll just say this as a caveat. We've all seen instances where our peers have attempted to do things and it goes way left. I am not saying to do those types of things. What I am saying is, how included are your kids, students, in the process of creating their own learning in your district? How included are the parents in the curricular issues? How included are, the community experts, the baker, the plumber, the this or the that? Because all of those things matter in terms of representation. Moving forward, discipline and classroom management. This is one of the biggest things that I talk to my students about when we talk about your job, like what a teacher's supposed to do and what the purpose of education is, because this is often the area where there's so much subjectivity and where we see a lot of those pre-existing conditions, right? The privileges to be, or the freedom to have or express certain ideas. And so my provoking statement is this: order and structure is linear and often top down, either teacher to student, policy to teacher. Y'all get the point. And if that is the case, how does this impact what students expect and can envision for themselves in terms of success later in the future? What do we do? Right? I know as a practicing educator, with the middle grades especially, there was almost this like anxiety about chaos. But when we think about some of the world's greatest thinkers and those who have innovative ideas and creativity and are successful in those areas, they work in a certain level of chaos. So if everything has to be ordered and in its place and stand in a line and raise your hand and do this and do that, are we giving our students access to practice some skills that might actually lead them in a path of innovation and creativity? These are my prompts to you. Excellent, excellent, excellent. We got lots of chat, lots of chat, lots of chat. Controlled chaos. Everybody's here. Excellent, excellent, great. And remember, I'm just kind of provoking. So where does this show up? Classroom and like in terms of success, right? Tone policing, notions of respect. This is the biggest one I see when I go visit student teachers in school districts across PA. Assertiveness versus aggressiveness. And where does that come from? Right? If we think back to some of the history that we were talking about before, who gets labeled as assertive and as confident versus who gets labeled as defiant and aggressive, and why? Because those labels, those markers follow kids throughout their educational trajectories. And when we think about notions of community, because we need support, we need role models, how are we using things like cooperation, collaboration, competition, and the notion of consequences, being accountable to one another, right? To foster community. We already talked about, how discipline can look in terms of academic preparedness. What kind of consequences are there when students don't do something, or when students do something well, right? Who gets the freedom to figure out who they are, to question and to push back? I also am, I'll go back to my own daughter, a pubescent 11-year-old. And there are many, 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 many moments I just want to put her on the porch and say, you live here, because she tests, but that's what she's supposed to do, right? But I know, and I've had conversations with her teachers, if I didn't have a relationship or rapport with some of her teachers, the way she expresses herself could be seen as disrespectful. And that would inhibit her ability to express herself freely, or at least freely in a sense of I'm figuring it out. Make sense? But because I'm me and I'm her mom, what if parents don't know that? What if there are things that are more, how do we navigate these things? Okay. And finally, just because I'm talking about family and community engagement, there's supposed to be, and I use that word very sarcastically, supposed to be, a trust, right, between family and school. Family and the district. Parents and the teachers. But historically, that is not the case. And so when we have a fissure, when we have a divide, when we have a gap between what my mom and my dad expect and what they expect of the teacher and what the teacher expects and wants me to do, where does the student fall in that? And how does that impact their capacity to visioneer, see and work towards, building towards a successful future? And if we're only talking about college, what happens when that student does not go to college? Do we deem them a failure? I mean, sometimes we do. If they want to become a chef, if they want to become a mechanic, if they want to be an artist, how are we infusing our expectations built on our own personal histories and the things that we have been indoctrinated to believe as a part of this institution onto this next generation of students? If you're with me, raise your hand, put something in the chat, a smiley face, a song lyric. I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. And so now that we've talked about these, how these hidden curricular norms show up, there's one more slide, right? In terms of family, right? What are you going to do? Is the question. I wish the goal of this webinar was for me to tell you what to do, but I can't do that. I am an outsider of the Cheltenham School District. I am also wise enough to know that I think, based on some of the comments, based on the resources that I've provided, you can begin to think about post-secondary success in more holistic ways. Because let's think about it. The kids we teach right now are going to be our plumbers, our doctors, our mail carriers, our internet technicians, our grocery store workers, our daycare providers. They're going to be part of our society. And if we don't have those people, no matter what their station in life, as we talked about before, confident, self-assured, critical thinkers, resilient, able to tap into their socio-emotional selves, it doesn't matter what they know. We know this. It doesn't matter what they know, because we're going to have issues. Okay, so what do we do? This is the final activity, because I know we're running up against the time. And if we have to take this activity with us, and you do it in a PLC, a professional learning community, with your grade group level, by yourself, with your team in your school. And I would highly recommend doing this activity in multiple iterations. First with yourself, then with your grade level team, or with your cohort as administrators, or whatever your role is. I would even have, the people who have what we consider more ancillary interactions with students, your custodians and maintenance technicians, every person who has any interaction with students, because they all influence what students believe about possibility and success in the future, right? Pick an area. Outline 2 or 3 pre-existing conditions or long-held approaches that you, your teaching team, your school district employ. And even if they're not long-held, what I found in recent months is that many school districts are trying to do things differently, and that's a great thing. But often in doing things differently, they get rid of aspects of their community that were actually working and that were invaluable to student success. So you have to have a clear and honest conversation about, why are we doing this? Is it because it's trendy to be woke right now? Or is it trendy to be inclusive in a way that speaks to another district's personality? Like, you have to do some self-assessment with yourselves and think about your identity as the Cheltenham School District, but as each individual school as well. What is our responsibility in terms of preparing our students for success at this level? And where might this approach benefit from a wider perspective about success and or future preparation? Who can we include? Who should we include? I would gather students, their parents, community members, teachers themselves. And yes, this is a process that takes time, so that no one's saying you got to rush toward the finish line. But if we do this, when they come over to my side, if they choose to go to college, or if that's in their their visioneered identity, or they go to, you know, vocational school, or the guy that just did my citing just asked me yesterday, do you know anybody who's willing to be an apprentice for a contracting job? College is just one opportunity for our students. And are we providing multiple pathways towards this success? Is my question. Okay. This activity is on the worksheet. And for the sake of time, it is going to be my takeaway for you. I encourage you, particularly because this is a professional, it's an open invitation to do this work. I want to make sure that you all have access to me. So I'm also going to give you my information. Just give me 1 second. If there are any questions, I want to go ahead and turn it over to the facilitators so that they can take questions. Gabriella? Hello?
Thank you for sending the invitation to unmute because I couldn't do it on my own here.
No
Appreciate that. I just want to, first of all, I just want to thank you so much for speaking today for this event, and we are very grateful. I just want to remind everyone that this event was brought to you by the Special Education Alliance of Cheltenham, and it was developed by Pennsylvania Inclusive Higher Education Consortium. And we are look forward to see you again for part number 3, which right now it looks like it's going to happen April 7th. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Primus for this presentation, and I am looking forward to looking forward to seeing everyone again on the 7th.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. I have gone ahead and put my contact information in the chat for everyone. Feel free to reach out to me. If you have questions, feel free to give me your thoughts and opinions on this topic. I appreciate your patience with some of the technical difficulties that happened earlier. I want to thank the Pennsylvania Inclusive Higher Education Consortium for inviting me to give this talk to you all today. I appreciate you for your attention and your participation. And I hope you will continue this conversation with your colleagues, with your students. And just remember that success and how we prepare our students happens inherently. And I just want to make sure we're doing it intentionally. Thank you so much and have a great Wednesday afternoon.